So Monster of Peladon is interesting, as it sees the Doctor returning to a previous planet by choice, but there is a time difference allowing for us to see the impact of the previous story. This idea is unique for the show, but the problem is that the story it's attached to isn't good. In fact, it's perhaps the worst of the Purple era. So let's dive into this serial and find out what's gone wrong, both on Peladon and with the story itself. We begin relatively strongly, with an idea which is admittedly repeated from the previous serial, as we have people being terrorised by the presence of Agador, who this time is appearing as a ghost and actively killing people. But from here the plot begins to slow and become boring, as we get into the politics of the miners and what's been happening since Peladon joined the Federation. Now this could be interesting, but it's stretched out far too thinly, and so it just keeps on going, with the plot trying to keep things moving by introducing elements and using them as sparingly as possible. To explain the conflict, we'll talk about the villains of this serial, which are the Ice Warriors, alongside a man named Eckersley. Eckersley is the more interesting, as we see more of him throughout the serial, and it isn't obvious that he is the villain, as by the time the Ice Warriors are introduced, they are clearly on the villainous side. Eckersley was the Federation mining technician, who was in charge of the mining operations on Peladon, but was greedy and so worked with the Ice Warriors for his own gain. This included the conquest of Earth so he could rule it. To achieve this, he was subverting mining so that Galaxy 5 could win the war against the Federation. This was done through the use of a matter projector and a heat ray, allowing him to make it appear that Agador was attacking people, causing the miners to rebel. There are some hints towards his villainy early on, and we do see him take action through others to make him seem uninvolved, notably where he convinces Alpha Centauri to summon the Ice Warriors. He's certainly not the most compelling character sadly, but Donald G plays him well enough to make him stand out. Next we have the Ice Warriors, who have gone back to their evil ways, which is something I do find quite unfortunate. While the Ice Warriors were evil in their previous serials, the change up in Curse of Peladon was a breath of fresh air, and showed their potential to be good. And while this serial only features a breakaway sect of them, it's still unfortunate we're seeing them as villains again so soon. They aren't as interesting as they were in Curse because of this, and they feel a lot like the ones we saw in Seeds of Death, where they were more simplistic soldiers. One positive I did draw out of this rewatch was realising that the leader of the Ice Warriors wasn't the same Ice Warrior as in the previous serial, something I had mistakenly thought for some time. It did improve the experience for me, as it's not seeing the friendly Ice Warrior go back to his evil ways, but it's only a positive because of something I got wrong with this serial, and not anything of the serial itself. On the Peladonians, we have a few, mostly consisting of miners with a few of the ruling elite, including the daughter of King Peladon, Queen Philera. Philera isn't anywhere near as interesting as the king was. She mostly sits around not doing a lot. Now there is a reason for this, and that's because she's a woman, and so in Peladonian society it's inappropriate for her to rule. This does allow for an interesting idea, which includes Sarah trying to teach her about women's lib, but this doesn't go anywhere as the serial's actions and setting don't let her do anything. In the last few episodes she decides to go down into the mines to stand with her people, but gets captured by the Ice Warriors, and soon after she's recaptured by Eckersley, meaning she spends a decent chunk just as a damsel in distress. Given that this was written during a time in history when England was ruled by a woman, there was an opportunity here to do something with that idea, and battle the sexism of the time, which while it's addressed, nothing of interest happens with the idea. Then we have her advisor, Ortron, who isn't anywhere near as interesting as Hepesh was. Ortron is basically the reason that the planet is in such bad shape, as he has basically been in charge while Philera has ruled. His place in the serial is basically being the face of the problems within the higher-ups of Peladon, with them wanting the miners to work so they can get the benefits of being in the Federation, while the people who work go without. Definitely some commentary there, but Ortron isn't the most compelling character, and at times his dialogue seems to imply he's sympathetic to the miners' plight, despite being the main reason they're not working, while at others seeming completely against them, although it's not clear if he's just pretending when with the miners. There are two notable minor characters, and that's minor as in minor and not small characters, with them both having different views of the situation. Gebek is the leader of the miners, with him acting as a union member, being the one to speak with the Queen despite having no place outside of the mines, and so isn't really seen as a proper person. He is interesting as we see him try and push against his status to the detriment of his men, but we're constantly being held back by Ortron. He does side with the Doctor after seeing him stand up for the miners, which does allow for the Doctor to gain a foothold in the mines, even if he's constantly challenged. The other miner is Etis, who is a rebel against the system. Unlike Gebek, he is very open about his views about the Pleiad's position and stands up for his people, always fighting against the higher-ups. Etis goes to extremes to achieve his goals, with him starting constant rebellions, with him leading a raid on the weapons lockers in the castle, then stealing the mining laser to destroy the castle. He even goes to the extent of killing one of his fellow miners when he's going to betray him to Gebek. He does get his comeuppance in the end when he tries to use the laser to destroy the castle and it blows up in his face, but he is just an annoying character who really doesn't feel redeeming, and is being overplayed, to not even an enjoyable extent, making it quite hard to sift through his scenes. On more positive characters, this serial brings back Alpha Centauri, who is a welcome return. Yes, they are just as screechy as in the previous serial, but as they're the only person who knows the Doctor and Peladon, it means that they end up being the person to save him when he's about to be executed in episode 1, but also being the one to vouch for him on several occasions. There are some fun scenes which they share with Sarah, but is usually being manipulated by just about everyone. One thing to note about Centauri in this serial is an odd change which seems to have been an accident, that being the change of them to he. To explain what I mean, it was explained in the previous serial that Alpha Centauri's race are genderless, but this serial seems to have ignored that and made Centauri a he. It's an odd thing which was more likely an accident, but it just feels strange while watching to hear Centauri referred to as he. Next for Sarah, who feels a bit more useful in this than the previous serial, but is still definitely a step down from the two opening serials. There isn't too much for her to do in this serial, and Tracy spends a decent chunk of time either with Centauri or as a prisoner. Now her big moment is obviously when she's trying to teach the Queen about feminism, but given that the plot ends up going nowhere with this, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Even some of her more inquisitive moments feel more accidental than her going out of her way to find the truth, notably when she stumbles upon the refinery, which was due to her going to find the Doctor and not her searching for clues to the mystery. While this doesn't exactly hurt her, it just makes her kind of dull in the story, although she does get a great moment when she thinks the Doctor is dead, and the sense of emotion on her face is strong. Sladen is what is selling the character in this serial. On the Doctor, he gets to do quite a bit, but as slowly as possible. Due to the plot needing to last for so long, at every turn he is countered by someone. First it's Ortron, who thinks he's a spy. There's the miners, who just don't like him as he's working with the higher-ups. Then once they've been sorted, it's the Ice Warriors. It just makes the serial feel slow, as the Doctor can't do much to progress, which I guess is true of the sort of situation the planet is in, but in the context of a story, it just feels like bad pacing. We do get to see him fight both physically and mentally. Something of note though is that we see him sending the statue to kill the Ice Warriors, which is quite a move for the Doctor, with it being the least arguable murders he's ever done, and at the same time fights off an alarm which will make his mind into liquid, but he sees it as more an annoyance of full power. There are several physical fights throughout the serial, with the most notable being one of the most notorious in the show, entirely because it's clear that Terry Walsh was doing the fighting, as the framing of the shots doesn't hide his face at all. They did attempt to dub some dialogue over, but it clearly was not purposely playing the role here. The most interesting bit here is that the reason he's on Peladon is that he was going to see the King again, but lands in a time after he's died, which does give some tragedy to the serial. But the most tragic thing to come out of this serial is the death of Agador, who returns briefly, first being used to try and kill both the Doctor and Sarah, but that fails due to the Venusian lullaby, and again later to track the Queen, but is killed by Eckersley. Something I want to talk about is the minor connections this serial has with the two previous penultimate serials, as there are a few odd connections. The connection to Hartnell's penultimate serial is the writer, as both The Smugglers and this serial were written by Brian Hales, the former being his last script not to feature the Ice Warriors, while this was his final for the show. There are two connections to the Space Pirates, those being the appearance of Donald G as a prominent character, and the other being the production codes, as Space Pirates had the production code of YY, while this one had the production code of YYY, something which is quite funny given both these serials' quality. There really isn't anything I want to talk about with the behind the scenes. The biggest thing is the Ice Warriors costumes, which have got an update, colour wise, as they are now a darker green, which really works better than the lighter green, which had previously appeared in Curse. The only other thing is that the production team went out of their way to make the serial feel as close to the tone of the previous Peladon serial, and while the script isn't anywhere near the quality, the actual sets and production is, just with the lights turned up a bit. This visual cohesion is very nice, especially given how varied the show can be with long-running sets and locations such as the Doctor's laboratory and the TARDIS itself, which often changes from serial to serial. If there's one thing I can say is good about this serial, it's that. So Monster of Peladon is a mess, and there's no other way to put it. It's definitely a downgrade from the previous Peladon story, and certainly weaker than the previous serials in this season. Quality-wise, it's on the same level of the Space Pirates, but without the hope that it can get better if it's recovered. It is perhaps the lowest point of the Pertwee era, with its only competition being the Time Monster, but at least that serial didn't take a previous location and screw it up, unless we argue it's the same Atlantis. But next time, the past comes to haunt the Doctor as events are in motion for a creature to rule the universe, and the moment of truth approaches for the Doctor. Next time, Planet of the Spiders.